What's up and welcome back to the channel. This week I'm uploading part 1 of what's going to be an ongoing series I'm calling the Beginner's Guide to Editing. I'm going to take you through everything from importing your footage to setting up your projects all the way to delivery and exporting. Now, I want this to be a reference, so if you're already experienced, some things may seem very basic to you in this series, but for those of you that need it and want to pick up editing, for example, this should be a good guide to teach you the basics, and I'm going to have a lot of tips along the way. This will be a great guide to get you up and running. With that, let's roll the intro. All right, so before we get started, if you're new, thank you so much for taking the time out to watch this video. New videos go up weekly, all about filmmaking, reviews, and so much more. If you haven't done so already, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like down below. It really helps me out immensely. I wanna make sure we can push this video out to everybody that needs it. With that, let's get right to the video. Okay, so here we are in Resolve, but I'm actually gonna be hopping in between Resolve and some Adobe programs like Media Encoder and Premiere Pro, only because I work in both, so I figured I'd show you both in case you guys ever need to use another program, or you're currently using both like me. The principles we're going to talk about apply regardless of software though. First up, let's talk about setting up our projects. So in large part, we're gonna have to do 3 things: reformat our media, ingest the media into our editor of choice, and third, organize. You'll also wanna have your own organization system outside of your editing software as well, so you can easily find clips and remain organized throughout the editing process. There's nothing worse than scrambling to find clips or shots you know you've seen but haven't organized. On larger productions, you may have an editing assistant to help you organize all of your clips by whichever system. For example, I usually organize clips by scenes and takes, but I've also organized reels by shoot days as an example. That being said, on most jobs starting out and smaller productions, you'll be your own editing assistant, so get used to doing things by system now, so by the time you get more complicated jobs, you're already used to it. I'll show you a tip here, but this is my overarching file structure I use on a project. I have all of my sequences or timelines organized first, then all of the raw footage, typically broken down by scene, then my selects, which are choice parts of all scenes I've picked out to be used in the final assembly of the video footage. Next, I have 4 folders here that are used for all of my other assets like music, sound effects, any graphics I might need, and any visual effects assets I might need as well. I keep the same file structure in Resolve and Premiere as I'm moving through my projects, and I'm always making sure clips and assets all end up in the proper place so I can find them later. So first up is making sure our media is in the right format. For YouTube videos or other small shoots, I might just have my memory cards straight from the camera. If you're recording on a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera or any other cinema cameras, you might have either the CFast cards or hard drives with all of the raw media. Most editing software now is compatible with all forms of RAW formats straight from the cinema cameras, but you'll probably want it in a format a little easier to handle since the RAW files are huge and contain a lot of data for your computer to process constantly. Most prosumer cameras have some version of H.264 or H.265 encoded video that you'll get from your memory card. These are just video formats, and H.264 is the type of encoding the camera uses to process that footage. Formats like H.264 and H.265 are highly compressed and as a result can be difficult for your computer to process. So I typically encode mine to a different format like Apple ProRes format or DNX HR files. Now, this isn't 100% necessary for things like YouTube or social media video, as most computers can handle even H.264 videos just fine for editing, but once I get to bigger projects, I'm re-encoding almost every time. Either that or I already have it set up so that my editing system debayers the footage properly from the RAW format, the RAW file that I import into my video editing system, and then I just create proxies to work from there. So far, I've been talking about re-encoding the RAW files, but most times you can actually work straight from the RAW files as well. But in order to speed up editing and not overload your computer, you can create what's known as a proxy file. Proxy files are usually smaller in size and resolution, so if you're working with 6K raw footage, for example, or like 8K red raw footage, which I'm about to show you in a little bit, your computer might not be able to play back smoothly all of that footage. You can create a 1080p proxy file which will point back to the original raw footage when it's time to export and deliver, but while you're working with it in your editor, it's a much smaller file and your computer shouldn't have a problem playing back at a lower resolution. Editors do this for a variety of reasons, but most importantly is speed. When you're editing, you have a lot of footage to go through and limited time, so you want to make sure you're not wasting time and you can scrub through your footage smoothly. Okay, so how do we make them? Well, in Premiere, I have this 8K raw footage in my media bin. Let's drag it over to create a timeline with the same settings as my clip here for example purposes. As you can see, if I drag the playhead around, it's quite slow and choppy. An entire project of this would be a nightmare, so let's fix that. If I right click on the media here, and by the way, if you have more than one clip, just shift click all of them at once and right click, then go to Proxies, create Proxies. Media Encoder will then do its thing. And if I go to the original folder, it actually created another folder where it holds the proxies for easy reference. In Premiere, let's go to our viewer and press this plus button, drag this icon down, and then if I enable it, it's now enabled the proxy version of the clip. I can then scrub through this fast in real time, edit, and when I go to export, it'll export with the original media size and quality. In Resolve, I have the same clip loaded here. The process is just as easy. On the Edit tab, I can right click and go to Generate Proxy Media, and it'll render out a proxy file based on your project settings. Here in the bottom right corner, if I click this and go to the Master Settings and scroll down, you actually find this section where you can tell it exactly how you want it to generate proxy media. I might choose something like half resolution or quarter, depending on what the original file is, and probably select something like DNxHR-HQ for the format. Once it's done generating the proxies, if I scrub through again, you'll see it's super smooth. When I export it, it'll use the high-res versions of the clip, so no worries there. If I want to do something like color and I need the high-res files to see what I'm doing, then I can go up to the playback menu and uncheck Use Proxy Media and optimize media there, and Resolve switches it out for the original high-res file. In my media pool, I can also link proxies created elsewhere, for example, the ones that I created in Premiere. If I want to use those, just right-click the clip and say Link Proxy Media, find where I saved the other ones, and then open that file. If I want the high res again, just unclick Proxy Media in the playback menu and you're good to go. All right, so now we got proxies all sorted out so you can edit fast. Let's take a step back and talk about actually ingesting your media into your editor. So both Resolve and Premiere are pretty straightforward. They both have media browsers that I recommend importing the footage directly from. Both also support just dragging and dropping your folders and footage over, but sometimes I have run into trouble where media didn't work for some reason. If you go through the media browser, you should be good. I usually build out my file structure in Premiere and Resolve to keep everything organized. When you start a new project in Premiere, it'll ask some basic settings. I typically save my project files where I'm keeping everything. I'll name it under general, just make sure GPU acceleration is on if you have a dedicated graphics card. I think for Mac, this would be OpenGL, I believe, or Metal, something like that. I can't remember what it's specifically called. Just make sure it's not the software only if you have that option, so that way you're using your computer's graphics power instead of just your CPU. Everything else I leave the same. In Resolve, it has its own database where it saves your projects. You can hit New Project at the bottom and name it, and it drops you into Resolve. From here, I would click on the little settings icon at the bottom right to set up your project. I have a much more in-depth video on project settings for Resolve that I'll drop in the corner so you can check it out after this video. I'll also link it in the video description. For now, just some basic settings. Set up your timeline resolution. In this case, I want to create a 1080p video, so that's my timeline resolution. This will be the size you export in by default. Timeline frames you want to set to whatever frame rate you shot your video in as well. Hey, all right, so quick explanation about frame rates here. When I film a video, it's recorded in 23.976 frames per second now, or FPS. That means that a camera is essentially shooting about 24 consecutive pictures per second of video to create what we perceive as motion. Now, 23.976 or 24 frames is what has been traditionally used for things like films, all the way since back in the day of shooting film on actual film stock. Broadcast typically shoots things in 29.97 or 30 frames per second, and it can give you a smoother playback, but often it creates the very digital feel, or what some people often refer to as the soap opera effect on TV, where the motion is kind of too smooth and there isn't typically the motion blur that we're used to seeing, that our eyes are kind of accustomed to seeing in films, for example. Now, that also has a lot to do with shutter speed, but we won't get into that for this video. Now, for editing purposes, I want my timeline to match my most commonly used frame rate. So, for example, since I shot my video in 23.976, I want my timeline to be playing at 23.976 as well. If, for example, I have a bunch of 24 FPS video, but set up a 30 FPS timeline, then I don't have enough frames to fill per second of video. So the playback is gonna freeze a little bit to try to fill up some of those frames and kind of fill in the gaps. It won't play back smoothly. All right, so now that we got that out of the way, back to the video. Now, if you have clips that you want to be in slow motion, you want to film those at higher frame rates like 60 frames per second, and then interpret that footage down to your timeline frame rate. You can also add it to your timeline and then just do speed and slow it down by a certain percentage, but I usually go and interpret it into the correct time frame. That footage will then be slowed down, so it'll take those 60 frames and spread them out to play 24 every second essentially. That will make the clip longer time-wise, but also appear slowed down. So I want my timeline to be 23.976 to match my footage, and playback set to 23.976 as well. The rest will leave the same for now. Like I said, check out my other video for a more in-depth look at project settings. If you take the time to set up your project, you can then right-click in your media pool and resolve, go to timelines, and create new timeline. You can then name it and leave this checked to use the project settings. If you need to change that for whatever reason, you can also uncheck that and then choose other options. I'll leave it checked for now. All right, so there we go. Now we have a timeline and we can place our footage in the timeline and it'll play back properly and we can start editing. Alternatively, if you have your project settings already done, you can just drag your clip down to the timeline and Resolve will automatically create a timeline matching the project settings. In Premiere, it's also pretty easy. Timelines are called sequences. So you would go to your media bin, right click and go to new item sequence, and then you get a dialog box. I have my presets already made, so I can just select it. But if you don't, I recommend going to settings at the top, selecting custom, and then picking our options there. 24 FPS for the time base. The video resolution, I want 1920 by 1080, leave everything else the same for now. Display format, 24 FPS as well. Now video previews, which is your monitoring essentially, or the picture you see of your footage playing in the timeline by default, I think is set to iframe, which I don't know why. I recommend switching out of that as it's a pretty heavy format and rough on your computer. I switched mine to QuickTime and Apple ProRes 422 proxy for the monitoring. I usually leave it at 1080p. This doesn't affect your final export. You can name it at the bottom, but when you find settings you like, I recommend hitting this Save Preset button and saving it with a name you'll remember. I have custom presets for the different resolutions I work with and different aspect ratios, so it's really easy for me to come down here, and when I need a new timeline, I can just pick the one I need. Like Resolve, once you have that set up, you'll take your video and drag it over to the timeline, and you're ready to start editing. If your timeline settings don't match your clips, it'll pop up with a warning saying, hey, your settings don't match. Don't be scared of this. You just need to know why and if you need to change it. I'm not gonna change anything though, since I'm sure my settings are correct. And there we go. Clip is in your timeline now and you're ready to start editing. All right, so that's it for part one. Now, I know that's really in depth and we covered a lot of ground, but that's okay. You'll get it, I promise you. All right, if you need to rewatch it again or go back and kind of get some of the nuances, then go ahead. I'm gonna upload this video on my YouTube channel. Eventually, when I'm done all the parts, I may kind of combine them together and put them into one course that'll be all about editing. But for now, they're gonna stay on my channel. They'll be up so you can go back and rewatch it. All right, so essentially though, this video just covered kind of setting things up and getting you in place to start editing. This included settings, and we talked about timelines and setting everything up. Honestly, this is a lot of the upfront legwork that you're gonna have to do in order to set up your projects, be organized, and allow you to kind of just go through and edit the rest of the video so that you don't have to slow down for these kind of things. So it's better to do this all up front and then have everything ready to go when you're actually editing. So once you finish setting everything up, it's actually pretty much just smooth sailing the rest of the way. And we'll cover the next part in part 2 of this video. So make sure that you're subscribed, leave a like down below if you learned something, or if you're enjoying this new video series that I have going on, let me know your feedback down below. I'd love to hear from you guys, so I'm gonna be sticking around after each time I upload videos, and even later on in the week as well to read and answer comments that you guys have, or if you're running into any trouble. So until next time, go out there and create something though. thought of a day.
I realize your love